Okay. Why don't we get started? Greetings and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elihu Rubin. I'm very happy to be your moderator for our second session of the Denise Scott Brown Symposium. Thanks very much to Frida for the invitation and to all of our outstanding scholars for presenting such interesting work. Our session is called City in Flux, Form, Forces, and Functions. The title is drawn in part from the name that Denise Scott Brown gave to the urban design studios she taught at UCLA and Penn. And we have three excellent papers from scholars who have plumbed the DSB archives to retrieve narratives from Scott Brown's mid-1960s pedagogy in urban design at those two institutions. The results, as you will soon see, are fascinating and revelatory. Reading them, it occurs to me how indebted we are to Denise Scott Brown's synthesis of the works of her mentors and colleagues, including Arthur Korn, Peter Orleans, Herbert Gans, and others, and also to her tirelessness, her work ethic as an educator in the formulation of urban studies and urban design as an interdisciplinary inquiry into the social, political, and economic bases of city and regional development and their changes over time. We find here, too, in Scott Brown's considerations of meaningfulness in urban design and in her reckonings with functionalism, the intellectual antecedents of what will eventually become the groundbreaking work about Las Vegas and the basis of a multidisciplinary design practice that will fundamentally upend established modes of urban representation. I'm now going to introduce all three of our speakers in the order of their presentations and turn over the rostrum to them. We'll have time afterwards for questions and discussion, and we look forward to hearing your reactions to the work. First, we'll hear from Dr. Leanne Custer, who will present What Does 40th Street Want to Be? Tracing the Pedagogy of Denise Scott Brown at the University of Pennsylvania, 1960 to 1964. Dr. Leanne Custer is an art historian who specializes in the art, architecture, and urbanism of the United States. Her concerns as a scholar and a teacher focus on the ways in which images mediate ideas of place and space in order to ask whose experiences they fortify and whose they omit. Her work has been supported by the Smithsonian, the Terra Foundation of American Art, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Luce Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, the New York Public Library, among others. Dr. Custer has received her PhD and MA in History of Art from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA in History of Art and Architecture from Harvard University. Her current research focuses on the socio-spatial politics of urban air and its depiction in New York City from 1880 to 1940. A second project considers the pedagogy and photography of city planner Denise Scott Brown in the mid-20th century. Our second paper is from Sylvia Levin. It's called Positioning Denise Scott Brown, Los Angeles, 1965 to 1966. Sylvia Levin is professor of history and theory of architecture at Princeton University School of Architecture, previously professor of architectural history and theory at UCLA. She is author of many publications, including Flash in the Pan, Kissing Architecture, Form Follows Libido, and others. Sylvia is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. Levin curated the exhibition Architecture Itself and Other Postmodernist Myths at the CCA in 2018, which explores the impact of the postmodernization of architectural procedures. And our third paper today comes from Denise Costanzo and is called Functionalism as Fixation and Foil, Denise Costanzo is Associate Professor of Architecture at the Pennsylvania State University, where she teaches theory, history, and research methods. Her research centers on Italy's complex architectural resonances in the 20th century, including the Cold War reception of fascist works, the post-war entanglement of modernism and academicism, and the work of Siegfried Gideon, Colin Rowe, George Howe, Robert Venturi, and Denise Scott Brown. She is the author of What Architecture Means, Connecting Ideas and Design, and co-editor with Andrew Leach of Italian Imprints on 20th Century Architecture. Her current book project is Modern Architects and the Problem of the Post-War Rome Prize, France, Spain, America, and Britain, 1946-1960, which is forthcoming from the University of Virginia Press. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Leigh Ann Custer to the stand to present her paper, What Does 40th Street Want to Be? Tracing the Pedagogy of Denise Scott Brown at the University of Pennsylvania. Leigh Ann, please.
Thank you all so much for being here and for anyone who's tuning in virtually. I'm especially grateful to Frida and to Dean Burke and the team at Yale for inviting me to speak and for organizing today's events. I'd also like to thank David Brownlee, Craig Lee, Mary McLeod, Bill Whitaker, and Heather Schumacher for discussing the ideas that I'll be presenting today with me, and for former students of Scott Brown's and Scott Brown herself for speaking with me about this content. Denise Scott Brown, Robert Venturi, and Steve Izenour's influential publication, Learning from Las Vegas, was rooted in pedagogy. It began as a studio course here at Yale. Yet little scholarship has addressed the environment that fostered Scott Brown's teaching. Penn's Graduate School of Fine Arts, where she taught from 1960 to 1964. There, she developed not only her pedagogical approach, but also a formative way of looking and thinking about buildings, spaces, and urban form. Archival research conducted on newly accessioned teaching records, there's more, at Penn's Architectural Archives shows that during this time, Scott Brown developed several conceptual foci that would ground her later design philosophy. And throughout my talk, I'll be showing documents from this collection, as well as photographs from the George Pohl collection. So first, she emphasized that the street is an essential building block of urban form. Second, that urban form has communicative power, which she termed meaningfulness. And finally, that forces, the societal, economic, technological, environmental factors, and so on, shaped the architecture and open space of cities. Scott Brown believed that it was forces, and not only the function of a building or space as the modernists would have had it, that determined urban form. These theoretical positions coalesced in 1964 in the second iteration of her course, Studio FFF2, Form, Forces, and Function, an introduction in the city planning department that she developed for urban designers. In this enigmatic titular triad, form, forces, and function, Scott Brown challenged the old modernist maxim of form follows function, pushing students to consider a more complex relationship between structures and society. In general, her teaching integrated studio and theory. All of it went together, she recollected. Former students remembered that Scott Brown was a demanding and exacting teacher, interested in how people used spaces and gave drawing assignments that took them out into the city. Today, I will trace the emergence of these ideas within Scott Brown's teaching at Penn and analyze how they informed her related writings. The flow of ideas between the studio and the written page gave rise to the methodological approach we know best through Learning from Las Vegas. It began in these critical 4 years. Moreover, considering this early moment in Scott Brown's career alongside similar activities of Venturi, who also taught at Penn, brings the sexism that she faced into view, helping us to understand her achievements and her daring wayward eye as all the more remarkable. This is a relationship between the teaching and the writing. Okay. Scott Brown arrived at Penn School of Fine Arts, housed in Hayden Hall, which I'm showing you here, as a graduate student in city planning in 1958, when the curriculum was in flux. Dean G. Holmes Perkins had shifted the school's approach from Beaux-Arts to Bauhaus-inspired modernism. He emphasized graduate education and added programs in landscape architecture and city planning. During this time, architect and planner David Crane was one of Scott Brown's most influential advisors. His 1959 studio, A New City for India, became an important model for her interest in the street as a design problem and in the social dimensions of a city or region. According to a page of Scott Brown's notes, Crane argued that streets should be seen as opportunities. Think of them as buildings. Of urban form, he asked, who will read the messages? Moreover, the format of Crane's studio, with interdisciplinary research in the first half of the semester and design development in student teams in the second half, informed the courses she later led. After completing her master's degree in 1960, Scott Brown taught an introduction to urban design for planning students in the fall semesters of 1960, 61, and 62, the first iteration of which was co-taught with Crane. The course description spotlighted functional efficiency, or the ease with which a city could be used. Should we commute 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hours a day? Can you find your way without a map in central Philadelphia? In Levittown, they asked. They also probed what they called psychic and physiological reaction in city form, asking, why do some spaces feel peaceful, others insecure? Which table would you choose in an empty restaurant? Why? The West Philadelphia study assignment asked students to redesign portions of Spruce and 38th Streets near Penn. Students created the site model, which you see here, and analyzed existing conditions. Preparatory exercises included a collage to, quote, give an impressionistic feeling of a city, close quote. The student work unmistakably emphasized the signs, surfaces, and imageability of the commercial facade. Another assignment, form and function in the city, presaged those central topics in Studio FFF. Its first paragraph read, you will have heard the slogan, form follows function, and perhaps its counterpart, form evokes function. We hope to show that the relation between form and function, need and shape, goals and means is a complex and oscillating one, and that the question which comes first does not make much sense. The important thing to ask is, what are the kinds and levels of goals for which we can plan, and at what scale in the city do they apply? This critique of the singular direction of the modernist maxim form follows function, and an insistence on the multidirectional relationship between form, function, and as she would add, forces, would resonate throughout her career, helping to ignite a play with the meaning of existing sites that would become a hallmark of her work with Venturi. Also in the fall, in 1961, 62, and 63, Scott Brown taught a lecture course for first-year architecture students called Contemporary Theories of Architecture, City Planning, and Landscape Architecture. This class was part of a series of theories courses introduced by Dean Perkins. As this bulletin indicates, Perkins and the architect Romualdo Jurgala taught upper-level classes on civic design and architecture, respectively, and Scott Brown and Venturi taught the pair of introductory courses. For her course, Scott Brown organized guest lectures by the school's faculty. For instance, Kahn lectured on technology and design. Crane spoke on structure and climate and structure and movement. Scott Brown led seminars in which students discussed the lectures and the related readings, as well as what was dubbed the laboratory section for the review of drawing exercises. Such assignments asked students to observe the world around them, including places like Penn's campus and nearby Levittown. Stressing again the importance of the street for designers, her former student, Richard Bartholomew, recalled that the midterm asked students to trace the evolution of thought concerning the redefinition of the use of streets in the writings of Le Corbusier, Kahn, and Crane. Scott Brown lectured on theories of city form and growth. Signaling her interest in the subject, and assigned students an early version of her essay, Meaningful City, indicating a flow of ideas between the teaching and the writing. This theories course, which ran in the fall, was paired with Venturi's Theories of Architecture, which was held in the spring. Notably, in spring 1964, Scott Brown co-taught in Venturi's course and led its weekly seminars, and we see both of their names on this course description here. This marked the first time the duo taught together, cementing their partnership and the combination of research and design that they would bring to their later studios on topics such as the New York City subway, Las Vegas, and Levittown. And according to a note tucked into her 1962 teaching records, Venturi had agreed to serve on the final jury for Scott Brown's theories course the previous year, an early beginning for their lifelong exchange of ideas. Denise, he wrote, "Yes, I will serve on your December 11th jury. Happy Thanksgiving, Bob." Perhaps the studio course that advanced Scott Brown's pedagogical methodology the most was Studio FFF2, Form, Forces, and Function, taught in the fall of 1964. The first iteration of this course taught the previous year focused on a range of topics, such as Arlo Braun's study for a highway hotel and Jerry Wolf's Street as Space and Shelter Today. By contrast, FFF2 was a semester-long case study on Philadelphia's 40th Street, echoing the West Philadelphia study site from Introduction to Urban Design. Scott Brown's guiding question to students was, what should 40th Street be? That asterisk led to a note that explained that for their professor, 40th Street pertained to a zone 4 blocks wide between 38th and 42nd Streets, Woodland Cemetery, and Fairmount Park. Here's that zone denoted in yellow. At the time, these blocks were a mix of residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial areas west of Penn's campus. This band of change, as she called it, was experiencing great shifts. Under the banner of federally backed so-called urban renewal, Penn, the Drexel Institute of Technology, the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science, and the Presbyterian and osteopathic hospitals were expanding their campuses to create University City, demolishing residences and businesses, and displacing the nearby predominantly African-American neighborhood of Black Bottom in the process. In her course notes, Scott Brown pointed out that Penn's expansion had nothing to say of the existing and thriving commercial nucleus at 40th and Spruce. By choosing this site, Scott Brown was asking her students to engage the effects of urban renewal that were underway and to consider alternatives. Students studied existing conditions through mapping and graphic analysis. So for instance, they examined the grain of the built environment, or what she termed the degree of intimacy with which different elements are mixed, which you see here. Students Dennis Childs and Philip Carter mapped the imageability of the site by pairing perspective sketches of 40th Street's intersections with color-coded levels of street activity. Lucinda Sisler mapped existing land uses with yellow indicating single-family residences, red denoting commerce, blue marking institutional and transportation spaces, and so on. And Nelson Wong charted activity intensity patterns. Again, yellow residential activity, red commercial, et cetera. 40th Street served a variety of residence needs, and Scott Brown asked her students, if 40th Street isn't an environmental area or a socioeconomic group or a neighborhood unit, then what is it and what does it want to be? The answer may have been encapsulated in the title of Daryl Conybeare's student project, the 40th Street Strip. Calling this zone a strip locates semantically a critical precedent for Scott Brown's later interest in projects like Ed Ruscha's Every Building on the Sunset Strip of 1966 and Las Vegas's Quintessential Strip. In FFF2, as in her other courses, her teaching and writing were intertwined. Scott Brown again assigned her manuscript Meaningful City and asked students to write a paper on the determinants of city form, in which they addressed the societal, technological, and environmental determinants of form in West Philadelphia, concretizing the language that she would bring to her book manuscript. In 1965, Scott Brown published her essay, The Meaningful City, in which she had been assigning to her students for at least 3 years. The essay analyzed the ways in which cities communicate, including the heraldry or the written and graphic signs, and the physiognomy or the sizes and shapes of buildings. As architectural historian David Brownlee has noted, this terminology translated into the decorated sheds and the ducks in Learning from Las Vegas, and even more that the language of heraldry and physiognomy came from Crane, tracing back to the 1960 iteration of Introduction to Urban Design. Recall the prompt, can you find your way without a map in central Philadelphia? Like The Meaningful City, her book manuscript, Determinants of Urban Form, adopted a rhetoric and substance similar to her teaching. The manuscript opened with a definition of none other than form, function, and forces. The following sections treated the societal, technological, physical, and natural determinants of urban form, echoing the paper assignment from FFF2. Further, the introduction to the book manuscript paralleled the introduction to FFF. They both began with the very same admonition. As cities have grown to engulf most of the life of the nation, so through the problems which have resulted has grown the realization that city development must be guided and guided on many fronts. This overlap between the course and the manuscript indicates the centrality of the classroom and the discursiveness of her written course materials and the development of her design thinking that would later characterize her career and her work with Venturi. In fact, both architects used the classroom to sharpen their theoretical frameworks. As I have written elsewhere, Venturi's Theories of Architecture course directly informed his 1966 volume, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. Unlike Venturi's book, however, Scott Brown's major manuscript from the 1960s remains unpublished. This may have been, in part, due to barriers that Scott Brown faced, which Venturi did not. She was an immigrant, she was Jewish, and perhaps most significantly for her, she was a woman. In these ways, she was an outsider in the elite, white, male-dominated Ivy League world of architecture and city planning. Here she is sitting next to Saskia Nowitzki, one of the only other female faculty at the time. While Princeton educated Venturi, whose background as the son of Italian immigrants who had not graduated from college was already atypical in this environment, Scott Brown faced sexism, both explicit and implicit. She has recounted that as dean, Perkins, quote, thought of me as a teaching assistant, close quote, rather than as a professor. She taught twice as many hours as Venturi for the same pay, leaving her less time to devote to her manuscript. Scott Brown also noted that her book remained unfinished to an extent because of child-rearing duties that she later shouldered. What is critical here is that although Scott Brown was developing what I view as a course to book agenda akin to that of Venturi, she was not able to publish that project. But these ideas don't just disappear. Many of the concepts she developed in her teaching subsequently appeared in the multi-authored Learning from Las Vegas, an achievement that she shared collaboratively with Venturi and Izenour, a mode of creative practice that architectural history and the star system has historically failed to represent sufficiently. An examination of Scott Brown's teaching in the energized environment of Penn in the early 1960s, therefore, reveals some of the early origins of her theoretical positions that would come to be so foundational. Many later projects undertaken by the firm she led with Venturi, such as their proposal for the Strand District in Galveston, Texas of 1975, which I'm showing you here, were manifestations of the methods that she began cultivating in her classrooms. Survey existing uses, focus on the street as a space in its own right, and strive to make the built environment mean to its users. While historically she may have been teaching and writing from the margins to the detriment of her publications and professional recognition at the time, we can see that perhaps in a larger sense within the Graduate School of Fine Arts during these critical years, she was in fact at its very center. Thank you.
Okay, well, like everyone before me, I want to begin with a couple of thanks. First to Frida for her gracious invitation to participate in this project. Given her attention to commas, apostrophes, leading, and the fact that she speaks many of the most difficult languages, including English, better than I do. Her editorial work was really heroic. And I'd also like to thank Denise, who has clearly been very gracious with her time and generous to all of us for this project. But I would also say that she's been extremely generous to me personally since I was a graduate student. So it's wonderful that you're able to be here, such as it is, where you belong, at the center of debate. So to switch gears now from the personal to the professional, two methodological obstacles immediately presented themselves to me when I started to think about what we might call the problem of Denise. The first is theoretical. How do we think about biography today, about life stories, when the post-human has put the category of life itself under enormous pressure? The second is historical and has maybe two parts, both concerning the archive. First, what happens when you ask the archive, Denise Scott Brown, is there any chance that you'll get anything back that isn't Denise Scott Brown? And secondly, how do we manage archival choices when considering a period that I will call the long 1960s, when the death of the author was widely celebrated, but at the very moment that women, Black and brown people, and a whole range of other actors were finally gaining broad access to the means of discourse production. The academic year, 1966-67, operates as a laboratory, at least for me, for examining these obstacles. Although Denise spent much of her time doing field work that year, the year itself was a kind of lab space, a space and time detached from the types of determination that detached her from the types of determination that undergirded her before and after, a period of isolation or perhaps autonomy that generated intensity, the way the apartness of a laboratory creates focus. The year spent teaching at UCLA was an interlude between the structures of family and student life that had defined her conditions of possibility before 1965, and the requirements of professional and personal partnership that structured her life after 1967. Her time in California unfolded during a hairpin turn in a long arc of migration that began in South Africa via the late 19th century pogroms in Latvia and Lithuania, followed a path established by the British Empire to London, paused in Philadelphia, attracted to the presence of Louis Kahn, another Eastern European Jewish immigrant to the United States, moved quickly through Birmingham, New Orleans, Houston, Phoenix, and Arco Santi via Los Angeles to Berkeley, down to Los Angeles again, only to double back to Philadelphia in 1967 after a pit stop or two in Las Vegas. There are many remarkable features of this journey, but one is that Denise was rarely alone. First, she was with Robert Scott Brown, then at Penn, where close friendships and people who took some particular care upon her widowhood, including helping her get to Berkeley, closely associated with Penn, and then from Vegas onward with Robert. Even the magnificent drive, these are some of the letters she wrote home during this crazy drive across the United States, across the country, included the company of her mother. She was comfortable at Berkeley, as you see above, where she lodged in the warmth of the Women's Faculty Club in a city she found easy to be in. Lovely, she writes, like a toy, without challenge and requiring no participation. None of this holds true for her year in Los Angeles, spent unmarried, untenured, living alone, only one of 3 faculty members at a new school of architecture, but the only one among them who had just arrived in Los Angeles, and therefore the only one without other professional associations in the city, and the only woman. This detachment, even untethering from familial and institutional affiliation, was perceived by some of those around Denise to have led to an intensification effect. Well, you're just gonna have to take my word for it. I can see that it's gonna be very hard for you to read these, but I've given you some little pointers to get to the good bits. But anyway, Herbert Gans, for example, believed her isolation was leading to an overinvestment in teaching. After visiting her studio as a guest critic, he wrote to wish her good luck. You can hear a little irony in his voice, if not just a touch of condescension. By that, I quote, I mean simply that I had the impression that you were overloading not only the students and your fellow faculty, but also yourself. There are costs to your social life. Do call Edith Arlen. She's a nice gal. Leyland Burns, already then becoming a prominent scholar of housing economics and policy, had a similar concern about the intensity of her teaching, expressed with less care than Gans's, but perhaps more explicit cruelty. This is a graph he made after attending her review, showing the relative collapse of energy over the course of the day. I mean, we've all had days like that, but how many times have you gone home and graphed them and then sent the graph to the person who invited you to the day in the first place? Well, she once remarked with bemusement that people mistook her to be, quote, straight-laced. She was also frequently harassed by male colleagues at UCLA. Relations with female colleagues were also fraught. It would later emerge that her neighbor and friend, the only woman invited to participate in the studio, the writer and critic Esther McCoy, had from the moment of Denise's arrival in LA been nurturing unspoken competitive anger and resentment. Denise was under the sword of publish or perish, a threat made more acute by the loss of 2 academic jobs in quick succession, and had the task of teaching urbanism to students who had lived through the recent tumult of freeway development and the Watts uprising that was in part the result. Unlike Yale, that has the resources to preserve every aspect of its history, the state universities of California are not so lucky. So the record of student work is not as rich as the record of student work done here. But this is one of the projects done for her studio in LA, and it's mostly about the freeway. So one outcome of this context was this remarkable syllabus, a version of a course that we just so brilliantly heard about that she had taught before and would teach again. So as you heard, many components of the course reflect the studio culture developed at Penn under the influence not only of Gans, but of David Crane and William Wheaton, a cartographic understanding of urbanism, a sociological view of urban life, and a teamwork approach to studio production. The syllabus also refers to the iconography of everyday urbanism, a theme that would develop in later studios taught in partnership with Venturi. There is little that is, in other words, unique or original in this document. What is distinct, however, is the studio's fullness and intensity, an amplitude derived not only from the syllabus's extraordinary length, but also from the course's extensive interdisciplinarity, the large number of participants, and the array of research and visualization techniques presented to the students. The studio had 132 class sessions. You start to have a little sympathy for Leland Burns. Each had multiple readings, detailed assignments, bibliographies, lectures, and field trips. Where she had previously argued that urban form was legible to those reading underlying determinants, the number of these factors multiplied. Her courses had always been interdisciplinary, but the degree and range of engagement with other disciplines exploded across the academy. Fieldwork modeled on what Gans's called the participant observer technique was not new to her teaching, but the field shifted from a few city blocks in Philadelphia to the entire region of Los Angeles, ranging from Disneyland to the beach, downtown, and much in between. In response to the extreme conditions of Los Angeles, both of Los Angeles and of the life she led in Los Angeles, the life of this Lithuanian, Latvian, South African Jewish woman, urban planner and architect, Scott Brown's 9-page Berkeley syllabus became a total design pedagogy. If alienation was a condition that yielded this intensity, intensity had its own effects, particularly registered in the way visual technologies were used in the studio and in the way the studio structured its own discourse. Visitors, no fewer than 38 of them, were an important component of the studio, and several focused on the role of visualization in urban research. Philip Thiel, for example, an architect who studied with Kevin Lynch and Georgi Kepesh at MIT, argued that rapid urbanization had left designers, and I quote, embarrassed by the lack of both a theory of form and of tools useful in representing the experience of those forms, end quote. He argued that motion pictures was a good way of describing urban movement, but was still too costly for most architects. As a result, he developed a low-tech system for, and I quote, the continuous representation of architectural and urban sequence experiences that was what he called parametrically adaptable to differences in the rate and direction of movement. He argued that this technique improved on film in one important regard. Citing Sergei Eisenstein's concept of vertical montage, Thiel maintained that cities, unlike films, could not and should not control the attention of the audience as a film director did, and therefore required representational tools that were not predetermined by a single planner. Thiel's manually calculable system for parametric notation was instead intended to privilege precisely a horizontal approach to urban planning that relinquished the psychological confrontations of avant-garde cinema in favor of a more detached, fluid, and hence less controlling structure. Peter Kamnitzer was not an out-of-town guest, but a colleague of Scott Brown's on the small UCLA faculty, who was then just starting work with NASA and GE on what would become Cityscape, a high-tech digital simulation. I feel as though I must have let advertising blurb from the archive into my text, apologies. A digital simulation of urban experience intended to enable planners creatively to manage the complexities of modern buildings and cities. Like many planners and fantasists, including Rainer Banham, Kamnitzer believed that the new freeway system might provide the means of challenge and participation that Scott Brown felt was lacking in San Francisco. One of the principal technical developments of Cityscape was its use of a joystick rather than camera or pencil as the user's means of navigation to the simulation of the freeway. Cityscape both offered a means of acclimatizing designers to the new speed of urban movement and captured data derived from user choices made during the ride. Optimistically imagining that these new tools could, and I quote, provoke the next creative leap, Kamnitzer claimed that joysticks and screens offered a new kind of process that may one day lead us towards a truly participatory form of planning. William Mosher, a transportation engineer, also a visitor to the studio, focused on developing statistical information about freeways and individual decision-making in the context of automotive safety. Using cameras and dummies, he staged simulated accidents to study the impact of human behavior in the context of what were then largely unregulated choices about speed, seatbelts, occupancy, and other automotive behaviors. Photography captured only some of the devastating effects of the so-called freedom offered by the freeways. Scott Brown's visitors occupied a techno-visual world dominated by simulations, hybrid and often improvisationally made apparati, and incompatibilities between the idea of individual participants and the abstractions of parametric, processual, and data logics. Scott Brown fully engaged this media environment. She argued that the Los Angeles of boulevards and freeways resisted prevailing analytic categories for describing perception and imageability derived from Lynch's work, and encouraged students to shift away from individual perception and to instead, quote, experiment with techniques and methods of drawing and photography, which gives some feeling of the multiplicity and complexity of patterns of activities and structures in the city and of their changes of intensity in space and time, end quote. She instructed students to begin with various forms of data collection, finding maps, discriminately scanning copious amounts of literature, conducting interviews. These are all things that she told them to do. And to conclude with, quote, experimental graphic techniques designed to move from specific data points to generalized populations. And she performed these methodologies via the large number of lectures she gave, illustrated by slides, most of which she had taken herself. A relatively small handful of these images have been widely reproduced, extraordinary images showing what we would now call the novel ecologies generated by freeways cutting through mountains, houses precariously perched on canyon edges, and agricultural land paved over for parking lots. However, as an archive, her photographic corpus is largely made of an astonishing number of images taken from above, from planes, and most interestingly from helicopters, which travel through a specific airspace that belongs neither to the logic of the close and granular view from the ground, nor to the omnipotent and totalizing view then being developed by satellite imaging. Scott Brown's images are not merely taken from the helicopter, but they are helicopter images, middle distance views that offer neither individuals or singularities, nor comprehensive panoramas. Often hazy and unbounded, these images seek patterns, data. They are images for and of research, remote, detached, distanced. Helicoptering was becoming ubiquitous in Los Angeles during the 1960s and drew all sorts of things into its airspace. Visitors to the studio, including Gans and Teal, submitted receipts for helicopter tickets because fleets like copterliners functioned as a form of public transportation. Disneyland offered rides both as transportation to the park and as entertainment over the park. Most of the helicopter pilots were veterans, particularly from Vietnam, where the Huey had begun as a means of medevac in 1958 and ended up a key component of the US military arsenal. What were called telecopters were also new and important features of the information environment, permitting live film footage of events unfolding below. The Watts Uprising was one such event that brought the impact of urban renewal into suburban homes via the safe distance afforded by the telecopter television link. The middle distance space created by helicopter traffic in the effort to visualize and manage urban information derived from a range of contradictory sources, sociological data, one-on-one interviews, news media, etc., had its textual analog in the way Scott Brown's syllabus organized discourse. Many comments, observations, and quotations are listed without qualification or analysis, without connective tissue of argument, including, this is just one page. I mean, there are hundreds of these. We saw this, some of them in Philadelphia as well. But I mean, they're just, they're just endless, more or less disconnected. And I point out this is an interesting page because it's a whole series of different sources. Some are students and so forth. And one of them is a newscaster. Anxiety about urban sprawl, the importance of tourism, the language of mass advertising, all combine to suggest the city is a TV show to be witnessed from the simulated space of the joystick and the helicopter view. People have stopped watching Los Angeles, the guy on the radio says. They know if they wait long enough, Los Angeles will come to them. So watch for Los Angeles appearing shortly in your neighborhood. Of course, Los Angeles had just appeared shortly in everybody's neighborhood on television screens when Watts entered homes across the country, just as it suddenly appears in the syllabus as well as a question left unanswered. Such comments and all the noise they carry have to be understood as part of the studio's rhetorical and media system. Scott Brown kept her teaching materials in Oxford pressboard report binders with metal prongs and multiple tabs, enabling her to add, delete, and reorganize materials to ensure that the pedagogy was as plastic and performative as the city being taught. Students too were required to produce reports containing text and copious photographs and drawings in this same format and to submit them in 50 ditto copies. That's a lot. I mean, that's really a lot. What you got to think about what you would do with 50 copies. The studio's entire output was, in effect, a collectively produced publication, a little magazine of the very kind Denise wrote about in one of her first publications. In 1966, Denise's book on urban planning was largely written, as we have seen, but did not find a publisher. It's important to keep in mind that the mechanics of how this gender difference between herself and Robert, how that affected publication possibilities. So complexity and contradiction, for example, appeared with the support of the Graham Foundation, the American Academy in Rome, the Museum of Modern Art, and countless other forms of institutional support. But that doesn't mean, given the 50 copies, that the syllabus wasn't published in its own way. Using clip, ditto, ink, and formatting, Denise treated her syllabus like a manuscript, which, like the good academic she was, she distributed amongst her colleagues for feedback. She was concerned, for example, about getting help with interview techniques because, as she warned students, some interviewees would be understandably wary of urban planners with what she called good intentions. But the distribution of the syllabus as a manuscript, however, eventually invited responses that went far beyond pedagogical tips. Mosher, the transportation engineer, consistently prodded Scott Brown to more explicitly address the politics of good intentions. He insisted that the scope of urban consideration should include issues of war, emancipation, and civil rights. He added notes on the growing importance of working mothers and the rights of women to urban planning and on the problematic nature of planning for public happiness. This is not, I quote, necessarily achieved by elimination of public squalor. Some subgroups of society have no, capital N-O, desire to live in the manner those in power plan for. Classic examples are the attempts to change the living habits of the American Indians and the attempt to change the living standards in our Appalachian region, end quote. Lee Barnes made numerous comments that argued for a more rigorous understanding of urban economies, but it was the sociologist Peter Orleans who was most pointed in his criticism, particularly in relation to examine the mechanisms controlling land use. That was Mosher, land use. He insisted, and I quote, "Values expressed in physical form are constrained by existent opportunities," and wrote that constraints on market allocation through racial prejudices make our system more like the tribal one than you suggest. Given that Orleans co-edited the monumental volume Race, Change, and Urban Society just a few years later, it comes as no surprise that when Scott Brown instructed students to make comparative analyses of Century City and Santa Monica, it was Orleans who wrote, "How about Watts?" On the one hand, the comments could be understood as a form of peer review, the referee process academic manuscripts undergo during the pre-publication phase. Indeed, the robustness of the comments suggests that the writers considered the document to be an authored text and not a syllabus outlining the transfer of knowledge from here to there. On the other hand, peer review comments are not intended to be disseminated. They are typically anonymous and meant to become eventually invisible, absorbed into a final freestanding text. Scott Brown did not absorb these comments in that way. Instead, she retyped them as marginalia in the final syllabus, making them extra visible with red ink. Her explicit goal in doing so was to avoid presenting what she called a spurious and dull unity, and to compensate for the fact that planners lacked what she called connection. In some ways, her book design transformed the syllabus into a demonstration of the multiple patterns that she was seeking to present as constituting the city and the dialogic and participatory structure of good urban planning. But at the same time, her design technique left the comments stranded, without connection, distanced from an author's voice, and at times close to the appropriation of the voice of others. Atomized, in other words. These pieces of text create the appearance of contrapuntal, interactive dialogue, but show no feedback effects, making them textual analogs to the helicopter view, not designed to reward close reading, but rather operating according to a digital code that, as Mosher wrote, man and his electromechanical monster, the computer, could not fully decipher. Although Denise insisted on the wonderful dullness of maps, I'm sure you've all heard her talk about that, the wonderful dullness of maps, insofar as it has been studied, Los Angeles has been attended to as the place where the Scott Brown and Robert Venturi collaboration was cemented, and from whence they launched their study of Las Vegas and spectacle architecture. Although she insisted in this syllabus that her students produce no false art, insofar as the role of the helicopter has been identified, it has mostly been related to artistic practices like Ed Boucher's. The teamwork and horizontal organization of Scott Brown's pedagogy and research techniques have been studied and talked about today, but perhaps to the neglect of the new kinds of alienation born of the complex media ecology comprised of an increasingly linked network of large machines, small devices, and mid-sized persons. This middle distance, too far to be personal, not far enough to be omnipotent, contained not yet legible forms of data produced by traffic systems, police surveillance, news outlets, and academic researchers. Like the editors, critics, writers, students in Denise's texts, these agents rarely collided, combined forces, or pooled resources. Instead, binders and inks tabs and ditto machines, helicopters and cameras formed a means of production shared by office stenographers, students, women, and other newcomers to public discourse that created an image of connectivity. Of course, no one invented the internet, but no one avoided it either. The internet is now, in effect, an elemental medium in and around us, difficult to visualize and filled with all kinds of good and bad intentions. But it is nevertheless altered by how we use it. Under the fraught circumstances of the 1960s, the connections imagined by planners were not all made. But through the reach of the long 1960s, the goal of overcoming the atomization of politics and the splintering of the public into niche audience remains palpable. Thank you.
I'll be repeating thanks we've heard already to the Yale School of Architecture for organizing this amazing event, to Dean Burke and everyone involved in making it happen, particularly to Frida for making this much needed volume happen and for the invitation to be part of it. It's been a real pleasure and an honor. To the incredible staff at the UPenn's Architectural Archives, the really committed curators of this material that makes it possible to explore so many unanswered, unasked questions about Denise Scott Brown. To Leanne, we were in touch early on about, we were circling around similar topics. You let me know about the FFF studios even before I'd made it back to the archives to look, and you generously shared early drafts of your chapter. So yes, help me out. So thank you for that. And to all of the contributors, I devoured the volume. I learned so much from everybody's writing and thinking. What I'm going to do now is cover some of the same territory that we've heard from Leanne and Sylvia, but I will be tracing a single red thread that is woven through the same time period and some of the same teaching and writing that we've learned about. And let's see where we go. Let's see. Okay. In a tiny article tucked along the gutter of the April 1967 issue of Architectural Design, Denise Scott Brown threw down a gauntlet using 354 words and an everyday object to undercut mid-century architecture's central ethos. What is the function of a table? I may eat off it, write at it, hold a party, dance on it, or drink myself under it. A child may throw a cloth over it to make a house, or turn it on end to make a boat. Different uses unfold over time. Breakfast for 4 in the morning, navigation for 2 in the afternoon, with extensions, dinner for 10 in the evening, and 200 years later, a museum piece. It is impossible to list all the functions served by a simple table across one day or many centuries. Given that, what does form follows function mean? Because the form of the table itself generates unanticipated possibilities. Form often precedes or even produces function. Scott Brown then zooms out in scale to ask, given a city's many complex and often contradictory functions, is there much meaning to the statement form and function are one? This was her teaser for a forthcoming book on environmental meaning. Although Scott Brown had already published essays on that theme, such as this one, which we saw earlier, the promised volume never appeared. The question of form and function, however, would persist for decades in her writing. Whoops, I'm one slide behind. There's the article. Would persist for decades in her writings, both sole authored and, as here, co-written with Robert Venturi. 36 years after her miniature article, she revisited the topic at length in the essay, The Redefinition of Functionalism, illustrated with photos comically enacting each table use she had described decades earlier in 1967. If these many published discussions make Scott Brown's later engagement with function something of an open book, her journey into that first piercing salvo in architectural design has been more obscure. Tracing the genesis of this one conceptual anchor in Scott Brown's career also illuminates her relationships with theory and her efforts to position herself as an urbanist, an architect, a thinker, an academic, and a professional woman during the first independent chapter of her career. That abandoned book project, Determinants of Urban Form, survives as a set of drafts and proposals from 1964 to 1967. Amidst its substantially evolving scope and structure, the 3 paragraphs used in her article, taken from a section on form and function, remain identical down to the last comma, from the earliest 26-page draft of September 1964, we see that at left, through a radically compressed 4-page version of 1965 to 1966. Have any of us left our writing unchanged down to the last comma? I know I have not. These 354 words, once crafted, remained fixed. But to what end? After wielding a table to challenge form's dependence on function, what precisely did she believe about their relationship, or whether form and function are one? The paragraph following the extract provides her answer, a resounding yes. It also asserts that function is the only true basis for the art of city building, although the relation between form and function in the city is complex indeed, and susceptible to no grand oversimplification. Her much shortened later version of the chapter, this is it in its entirety behind me, actually extends this one sentence by adding, as we broaden our consideration from the single building to the city, and from the short term to the long span time scale of city building, so we need additional ways of looking at the making of form. Her point was not to reject, but to problematize the form-function dynamic. The enemy was oversimplification. Scott Brown believed that each form is determined by functions, forces, and techniques, as well as the inner worlds of its makers, though in no very simple way. She planned to demonstrate urban form's dependence on all of these in her book, whose intended scope was immense. It would define urban design methods with conceptual precision and integrate complex variables from symbolism, technology, and transportation to demography, economics, and politics. No problem, right? Despite this impossibly huge undertaking, her treatment of form and function accomplished something very clear and powerful. A destabilized form-function duo is placed in dynamic tension with physical and social factors to become a modified nuanced axiom. Form, therefore, follows function, although possibly at a distance, and is determined by forces, shaped by the talents and temperaments of its makers. She transformed and stabilized a wobbly form-function dyad by adding that third F, forces. Scott Brown's elastic neo-Vitruvian triad of form, function, and forces dominated her teaching during these same years. As we've heard, she taught 3 urban planning studios entitled Form, Forces, and Function at the University of Pennsylvania in 1963 and 64, and at UCLA in 1966. The functions of the table photos were actually taken at Berkeley in 1965 for an introduction to planning course with a lecture on form, forces, and functions. Her huge, and I will add humbling, collections of lengthy detailed syllabi, extensive lecture texts, and elaborate written assignments, over investment indeed, document every aspect of the FFF studios, except the session defining concepts, including function. The book manuscripts fill that gap. The earliest chapter draft of 1964 was her lecture, dated the day before the definition section for that course. Its final 3 pages, as we see here, a carousel-ready list of slides. If you don't know what a slide carousel is, you're olders, we will enlighten you. The FFF courses promulgated a broad conception of the form, forces, and function triad. She describes the planner as a coordinator, guiding a city's form so it can perform stated functions and fulfill stated goals. This entails negotiating the social, economic, cultural, psychological, physiological, and other needs of the society and the individuals which compose it, along with formal considerations, immense and contentious variables. Scott Brown credits her views on function to her London years, especially the New Brutalists. They upheld the early modern functionalist revolution she identified with, and she assigned the Smithson's Team 10 primer as one of the readings for her FFF definitions lecture. Equally crucial was her graduate study at Penn from 1958 to 60 under the social planner Herbert Gans and her interdisciplinary mentor, David Crane, when she read sociologist Robert Merton on functionalism. But function was also a critical theme at an interim event, one she has not mentioned in this context. The 1956 CM Summer School at the Istituto Universitario di Architettura in Venice, where she and Robert Scott Brown experienced a month of intense discussion and design charrettes. All CM Summer Schools integrated urban planning and architecture, specifically focused in 1956 on Venice's industrial port cities of Mestre and Marghera. Team projects published in Casabella included regional transportation analysis and development proposals by the Scott Brown's group, which we see here. The 1956 event took a new direction compared to its predecessors when participants openly rejected CM urban planning orthodoxy. Whereas prior summer schools had seen only traces of anti-Athens charter positions, the 1956 group reportedly declared it an overly simplified planning instrument. And in contrast to what happened in previous courses, it was not adopted systematically by any of the studio groups. This echoed the contemporary critiques crystallizing into Team 10, which shared several leaders with that year's summer school, including Giancarlo De Carlo. The Athens Charter's famous call to design cities around 4 functions embedded this concept in 1950s conflicts over urbanism, and it was invoked critically and often during the summer school. Ludovico Quaroni declared Le Corbusier's mechanistic notion of function to be mistaken and prioritized understanding it instead as a compound of physical, spatial, psychological, and moral factors. Quaroni's insistence on a conceptual clarification of function and its complex human dimensions prefigured Scott Brown's later stance. So did Ignazio Gardela's positions on considering time in town planning and an obligation to find and resolve the forces in urban problems, invoking the third leg of Scott Brown's future triad. Carlo Melograni wanted to reclaim the functionalist rational method, understood properly, but also extend pure functionalism to consider the spurious functions of everyday life. He believed that function should not be defined through theoretical abstractions, but be grounded in a wide, empirical, and complex view of reality. Scott Brown kept translated transcripts of the summer school lectures and discussions. This event repeated and reinforced recurrent themes from across her tri-continental formation, but it also quite strikingly anticipates her persistent, even obsessive relationship with function, including an insistent and persistent adoption of the functionalist label. The intense debates over function and a determination to reclaim the modernist heritage seen during her month in Venice echo a decade later across her first publications. After Scott Brown's minuscule article helped her earn tenure at UCLA in 1967, she declared herself determined to finish Determinants of Urban Form. Despite a stream of declined funding proposals like the one we see here, she told her dean, "I must write this book next year with or without support." She began a year's leave of absence from UCLA in June, just a few months after another volume she helped shape had appeared. Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which included Vincent Scully's prophecies about the impact of that manifesto on designing in a non-straightforward world. A month after Scott Brown's writing leave started, she also made the pivotal decision to marry Venturi. That fall, they began a fateful chapter of co-teaching here at Yale, inaugurating their far-reaching joint work on functional forms in Las Vegas, Levittown, and beyond. In 1968, Scott Brown resigned from UCLA, and after 1970, they both began privileging their professional practice over academia. Although Determinants of Urban Form remained unfinished, it distilled Scott Brown's views on function in ways that reverberated for decades. The decorated shed and its progeny, the generic loft and mitten glove analogy, were already there. So were exchanges with Venturi. Her triad and his duality meet in a sentence on principles and theories of form, forces, and function, and the possibilities of form making and the place of creativity in a complex and contradictory society. This blending of their distinct voices defined the partnership Scott Brown and Venturi built from 1967 on. As we've heard, Scott Brown recalls setting aside her book project, of which she had only about 1/3, 7 of 21 planned chapters in draft form in 1967, because it lacked funding. Complexity and Contradiction benefited immensely from a Graham Foundation grant, and perhaps especially the accountability it carried. She also did so, as she told me in a lovely conversation, out of a desire to contend with real world problems instead, as part of Venturi and Rauch. I will add that this is also a critical moment. This career juncture has a very human dimension. She and Venturi married when she was almost 36, had already been widowed once. And it's clear that for both of them, the chance to build a family was a priority. They would adopt their son, Jimmy, in 1971. The implications of this shared decision were, however, intensified by her gender. The question remains open. If Scott Brown had published Determinants of Urban Form in some form, could it have been her complexity and contradiction, establishing her voice as an individual? As much as she indeed resisted the model of heroic sole authorship, she also very much wanted to be heard, a chance to participate in important disciplinary, social, and conceptual conversations, as well as accurate authorial attribution, have always mattered to her very much. One legacy of this critical juncture is clear. 40 years after the function of a table, Scott Brown remained a defiant Counter-Reformation functionalist, calling this ethos a glory of modern architecture and her profession's joy in 2008. For her, functionalist designers, paradoxically, do not try to control what structures will do. They clarify needs, aesthetics, and principles, yes. But they also recognize and respond to everything in flux that impinges upon them. As she put it, to face the ugly results of doing the right thing produces an agonized beauty, the kind I like, and it can change aesthetic sensibilities. That is my view of functionalism. For Scott Brown, functional design accepts the ways dynamic systems of form and forces inflect each other, what Leanne called this complex and oscillating relationship in that other passage. This is an apt lens for her engagement with function, shaped by encounters in London, Venice, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. In the mid-1960s, she used teaching and writing to develop theoretical clarity, a foundation for the difficult design decisions to come, and an attempt to reason, even argue, her way towards the professional authority she needed far more than her male counterparts. Scott Brown leveraged her razor-sharp intellect to think boldly and incisively about core design and theoretical issues, rigorously and fiercely positioning herself against simplistic certitudes and facile thinking. Functionalism was her foil, both opponent and weapon, in a duel with her own discipline. This leitmotif was a matter of both conviction and strategy. Like a table, Scott Brown's relationship with function is anything but simple. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all of you, for these three wonderful papers. I hope you're formulating your questions or comments back there. And I have specific questions for each of you, but I wanted to start with one that maybe each of you can address. One of the prominent elements in all of these papers is the way in which the archives have been brought to the surface for us and really showcased in many ways. And Sylvia, you were putting what we ask of these archives when we visit them. And I wanted to maybe you could reveal a little bit for our audience, some insight into your methods and research questions here. What were you looking for when you set off to these archives? Did you have a clear question, or did you let things unfold as you discovered them? It's been so interesting to get this in-depth look into Denise Scott Brown's preparation of these courses in the mid-1960s. It's so inspiring to see her work ethic and putting together these courses. So what were you looking for when you started off in the archives? And did it change? Was it inflected as you found them? How did you decide on some of the wonderful artifacts you chose to present with today? Leanne, you want to start? Maybe you can go into the sequence of your talks.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. It's bringing me back to the beginning, and I think stepping back and looking at it, I think I'm approaching the archives at maybe a mid-view to evoke the helicopter distance metaphor. They are so luminous. It's hard to do a close read, although you might have been able to do that with some portions of it, but it's so luminous. And maybe I have this mid-view between close reading and an overall aerial view of the archives. On a more personal note, the summer after my first year of graduate school,
Not hearing so well anymore.
for the Garden Architecture Class. They're an unprocessed part of Venturi's collection, and those were the teachers. And so I worked closely with Yale to process those teaching methods and figure out which slide lists went to which year, and I focus on this theory with architecture class and that related to philosophy of fiction. That theory's course, which I showed you the 1964 syllabus that it has background thing at the top, and so I wanted to know more about the collaboration in that year of that course, and then I just wanted to know a lot more about what's grounded in content. So that's the me that opened up into this project. So when I approached the work that I published in an essay in the anthology, that passed through. I was sort of looking at what did she teach when, and that an overview had not really been provided. So my essay is very article, most of what she taught when, and tries to pull out those conceptual foci.
So Sylvia, can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I suppose I think a little bit about the effective way is to really about a flea market, which is that every flea market is always the same. What's different is you the day you go. So I've been in that archive many times over the last very long time. And so I'm always, thinking about slightly different things. So this time I would say I was really struggling. As I really didn't want to do anything that was driven by the name Denise Scott Brown, and I would just never today do a monographic, start with a monographic answer to a question. So I was trying to figure out how do I do this and sort of not do it at the same time. And so I started to look in the archive for things that I knew would lead me both to and away. And my first time, which failed, that's not an event that happens. No. My first time was that I would go and look for her tenure review letters. Because I thought there would be no way to participate in an assessment of Denise Scott Brown in 2023 without it being overdetermined by all kinds of things. So I wanted to see what the assessments were in 1966. And I didn't find them immediately, but what I found was this series of letters that he had solicited and asked for as evaluations of her studio teaching. And I was very struck by that as a something to do. You know, just as a something to do. That's where the Steve Burns thing is. And, you know, I mean, I kept even the super fishy ones. I mean, it was just kind of amazing. Anyway, so that started a kind of that identified a rabbit hole about her in relation to other people. And I was trying to think, what did she never responded to these things? There were all of these intermarginal remarks, but she doesn't seem, except in one or two very small cases, she didn't re-edit anything in response. They just sit there, like, you have to understand that folks are pointing out things that she read. So when you were asking the question before about politics in the 60s, like those folks are saying, why aren't women being listed here? Why aren't racial feminists being listed here? Why is the law being listed here? Like, this is 1966.
Couldn't hear any of this.
Why they're not being, you know, she thinks we don't need to do that work. They were doing that work and having that conversation, and she typed it all up again. I mean, it's just kind of crazy and interesting. So that would be one thing. I mean, about where you know you have a bunch of bureaucracies. The other thing that I would just remark on the difference for me of archival work now and archival work before, and what close reading is. You know, close reading is a term developed by the literary critics that Venturi was reading. You know, and it's a very specific way of reading that turns the reader back to the author. So I don't think we read things that way anymore. We you know, we don't look at a text only as a kind of medium and backlog that kind of reflects the thing that, you know, we think about it in a different sort of way. So you know, if you think of archival documents, if you look at them in terms of their media structure, for example, that this is another path away from the name and all the things that it holds together, and begins to point out in many directions.
Right. And before we hear from Denise, can I just follow up, because I'm so interested in your take on that. I mean, on the one hand, the syllabus is fascinating as this example of multi-vocality and of acknowledging critique, but you're implying that there's a missed opportunity in terms of her failure to integrate them. Is that part of your take on it, or it seems very strange to you that she solicited it without actually doing more than rehearsing it in the syllabus?
So let's borrow the vocabulary of our judgment. I'm trying not to make a judgment. I'm just describing what I found. That's what I found. That is what I found. And all I can do is point out what I found. I was looking for it, and that's what I found. I don't know what else to say. You can ask her what she meant, you know. Well, it's remarkable. Let's just say, and we just gotta sit with you for a little while. I think it's so good through. If I can just make a turn, you know, when you were showing her table essay, you know, in the well, I was starting to imagine little something in the corner, you know, like position, all of that stuff you could talk about. But it was also right next to Warren Shaw, right, with a picture sitting in a computer console talking about transportation engineering and computation as a management of new forms of urban flow. So to me, it's more interesting not what she failed to do or what she succeeded in doing, but rather what was the world she occupied? How did we take a view of it? And you didn't get to keep that. It's not a question of running personality. This is the situation.
If I could jump in, I think because I found that syllabus and the comments incredibly fascinating as well. If anything, I think it's a demonstration of commitment to radical honesty. Because if upon hearing a critic's feedback, I then integrated, I sort of appropriated that. And of course, it's something we do all the time in academic writing when we get peer reviews. But there's something so bracingly transparent about saying, I'm not only going to make sure this idea is included, I'm going to make sure we know that I did not think of it. Right. That's just incredible.
She retyped them. I mean, I just to be really strict here, she retyped them. I don't have the notes of what the original thing was said. I mean, it's just interesting. And you know that I have a dream. It's really not to make that either. I mean, in terms of radical honesty, how do you put I have a dream in that in your syllabus? You cited everybody else's name, you quoted everybody, and that's just there by itself. And then in the assignment, it's what is your dream about a personal utopia? I mean, it's there. It's really important to acknowledge it's there. It's there. It's there in a very particular way.
Of course, that was the one line that didn't need attribution, right? Everyone would have known where it came from in some sense. But yeah, it's could you go on?
It's requested outcome. It's March. What's it later? Oh, it's March. Yeah, yeah, it's like however you want to talk about that. That's this.
Denise, did you want to go on though too? Talk a little bit more about in our house.
Well, I would simply say I think I have the easiest task in that Frida kind of gave me homework because I spent, it was great, for about 10 years ago, I grappled with the question of what Venturi and Scott Brown actually mean when they call themselves functionalists.
Right.
And in that discussion, which was primarily, it was based almost exclusively on their public statements, the little tiny function of the table essay was the starting chronological. That was really the earliest statement I was working from. And given that this is the moment when the they become a much more closely bound they, the possibility, the opportunity to figure out what exactly was Denise's journey into her own position was a way to approach the question of teasing out which voice is whose. And I think there's an incredibly important conversation to have about the impossibility of that on one level, but it's also part of this larger question about erasure and attribution. When someone is dealing with the professional conditions that she was in, there was a tendency to elide her presence and her voice. I think there is clearly a legitimate project in figuring that out. So I was looking through the syllabi function. Where is the lecture on the definition of a function? It was making me crazy until Bill came out. I was like, okay, here's a book manuscript. And there it is again. And there it is again. And nothing changed. That one really.
I was hoping you'd say a little bit more about your understanding of Denise Scott Brown's understanding of her functionalism. I mean, it's a kind of functionalism that is, in a way, without designated function, or with many functions over time. I'm wondering, is she helping correct a misunderstanding we have of the high modernists when they talk about form follows function? Is that one of the purposes she's helping serve here?
It is certainly the project that becomes the joint understanding. I would say that they certainly come out with very different kinds of priorities.
But so those great equations from Las Vegas,
Right.
what they object to is what they would see as a kind of mistakenly puritanical definition and to purify out and excise the aesthetic from the Vitruvian triad and say, the Gropius equation, even though it was really not Gropius so much as sort of followers probably, to say, is it possible to generate architecture that has its natural and psychological beauty to it? And their understanding, as I would argue, is that the modernist ethos of radical honesty requires understanding that the task of architecture is to reveal everything in the Vitruvian triad, not as a simplistic formula for success, but as a code, as something that inevitably generates tensions and all of those complex contradictions. That if we think in terms of the difficult whole Venturi's theorization, it's more about the difficult than the whole. So functional architecture cannot ignore the visual dimension, the aesthetic dimension, the experiential modality dimension. You are not, they don't think architects can not think about how things operate aesthetically. They might pretend they do, or themselves think they do, but it's impossible. So it is truly about, it is an ethos of radical about what it means to say the building works.
What it is to say that the building works.
And then she would, my essay was focused primarily on the architectural scale, but I think Scott Brown is clearly approaching that problem at an scale. We cannot say a city works if all we've done is address these limited variables, and that's the same level.
I wanted to follow up with Dan too before we go to the audience for questions. It's so great, so interesting to see the examples of student work from the FFF studios at Penn, and it made me think of something that was discussed earlier. Might have been actually something that came from quote from Christopher's writing on Denise Scott Brown. I mean, a lot of that description, documentation, and analysis would be very appropriate in an urban design studio today. And it led me to the question, did they come up with interventions, or was it really not an intervention-based pedagogy? Was it really based on this kind of research-based documentation and analysis? And in the end, that was the project. Each student built in some different piece of it with their own bit of observational, documentary, analytical projects.
Thank you so much for that question. It is allowing me to draw out more about student work in FFF studio. So they did propose interventions at the end of the studio. I just think what is kind of so, she wasn't the only one doing it. Sports in Ukraine, but the extensiveness of the research and the clarity of the research that she's asking students to complete in her studio class, I think is significant, and that's kind of what I wanted to draw forward. But yes, they do propose interventions in 40th Street and the other studios that she taught. And in fact, if you look at student work on 40th Street, there are student projects that high interventions and low interventions. So this is super interesting too, just asking students to kind of modulate low to high intervention.
More or less intensive.
Yeah. Since I think that if you think about the ways in which the practice of the work involves out with Venturi, there are low intervention projects that are really just so profound and high. Absolutely. Students.
Let's start where you began with Sylvia. And I was not alone. I was very sorrowful about my husband, and also with to tell Denise, the people at Chiam, they adored us because we were following next generation. And we introduced, I was very pro the what's called the linear city, and we did one for Mestre. And we had all those people to talk to. And we made friends with the young Italians, and that's when we started to photograph so much. The second month we stayed in Venice. You know about the first, we stayed 2. And when Robert died, Leda Vaccaro, now we worked for Giuseppe Vaccaro, and I'm still a very close friend of Carolina Vaccaro and Giorgio Azzariti. Those are people I've known since that time. And she wrote about Robert. He loved more than us, that which we loved most. And that's a lovely thing to have said about him. And then when we got to South, we were going to go back to South Africa, and Dave Crane set up the things he believed we needed. As a missionary's son, he grew up there, and he said, you will need this kind of backing. A lot of economics, a lot of sociology, which we wanted anyway. Coming from the Smithsons, we wanted that, and coming from South Africa. And so I did not feel alone, but I felt very sad. And then there were mainly my students were my big consolation, but not only. I made friends with a very old man, 50 years older than me, and I followed his learning about relating your field to other fields. And that's something that I think is missing in this book and is a good step to go next, which is how do we do a supportable Athens Charter, which uses the information I learned from people like Walter Izard and all of those, and which you don't know, and yet other people can help to feed that in so that you get a well-based Athens Charter. And then I started reading Laura Ingraham, and she talked about Le Corbusier talking about the cities of Europe being built by the donkey and donkey paths. And I say, I'm an African, I know all about donkey paths. And then I start saying, you know, the donkey needs to go around for example, Italian hill towns, because you have to go with the contours you can do with a cord of. So there's a way of thinking about donkeys. And then I say, in the end, the donkey is the functionalist. And when Le Corbusier says, when streets are straight, the mind is clear, Le Corbusier is the ass. And that's the way I would start off from now. I'm just telling you this. And then there are a few other things. Bob Venturi and I started collaborating in 1960 when he learned that I knew a lot about mannerism from having studied in England, and in America, no one knew about it. So I was giving him advice while he was writing his book. And I don't know all the things you said about that, but the same thing in Los Angeles. I was giving 9 semester credits worth of information. In other words, we didn't have a faculty. And I said, I'll take care of almost the full workload, bar 3 credits of the students. And I'll give them something that's worth 3 workloads by using various faculty members. That's how I met Lee and how I met various others as well. And also the head of the Los Angeles City Planning Commission. He was on my faculty. He'd come in and say, there's my boss. I was about 1'6" shorter than he was and quite a few years younger. Meet my boss. So that's why it's so large as you think it is, because it was doing that much. And I was occupying my time. I had other friends there. The one I met in Philadelphia, who was writing about musicology, Mr. Musicology from UCLA. Do you know him? Do you know his name? the very famous man, Charles Seeger, the father of Pete Seeger. And he became an advisor to me on how to think of a field not your own and bring other fields into it, trained at Harvard. And he became a lifelong friend until he died. And I was very friendly with my neighbors. They were all working class people, and we had a good time together.
And Denise, did that lead to your decision to write the syllabus the way that you did, with including these comments right into the text of the syllabus itself?
Absolutely. You see, that thing was for my students to own. They each had their copy. They each had everything in it, all the things I've said, all the way I organized and all of that, because I said, you are going to teach us. Use the stuff I've learned to be the teachers.
That's great. That's
But
so interesting.
I had love from them and good. You see, I've been teaching city planners, and it was the freedom of speech movement and all of that. And they were warm, friendly, very liberal people. And I have to really shake them up and tell them to stop. You know, I bull them out, and they loved me for it anyway. And so those warm relationships kept me going. And then Bob and I and the pictures you see of both of us, there was at least one in that book, looking so happy. And I'm standing with the hands like this. We were beginning to fall in love, but not until after 8 years. I didn't have 5 years of association with Bob. I had 8 at Penn. And when we gave that presentation for the Chandigarh studio, and Dave created primed Robert to be the one who talked about the transportation things, the 4 phases of movement. So Robert talked about that, and I talked about the housing. And they were Khan and Lieu both changed. Khan and Bob both changed their outlooks hearing Robert. And you can see the change, what they say the next time they start writing.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that. And there was one other thing for Sylvia, but I can't remember it.
Well, that is very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've been told that I promised to give a few minutes break between now and our next session, which is going to start just in about 5 or 6 minutes. So with that, I want to thank our wonderful speakers and papers in this session.